Jack knelt in the dirt, his hands calloused from years of tending to his beloved garden. The sun beat down on him as he carefully pruned the rose bushes, his brow furrowed in concentration. He murmured, examining a particularly vibrant bloom. Looking good, my dear. He moved on to the vegetable patch, his eyes scanning the rows of tomatoes, zucchini, and peppers. Everything seemed to be thriving, except for one peculiar lemon tree in the corner. "Now, what's the matter with you?" Jack said, approaching the tree and running his fingers along the leaves. They felt dry and brittle, and the fruit hanging from the branches was an odd mottled color. Frowning, Jack plucked one of the lemons and held it up to the light, studying it intently. "This isn't right," he murmured, turning the fruit over in his hands. A rustling in the bushes behind him made Jack jump. He whirled around, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source of the sound. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. A small, furry creature emerged from the foliage, its beady eyes blinking up at Jack. "Just me," said the squirrel, its bushy tail twitching. Jack let out a relieved sigh. "Oh, it's you. Gave me a bit of a fright there, didn't you?" The squirrel chittered in response, its gaze fixed on the lemon in Jack's hand. "You know, I've been tending to this garden for years, and I've never seen a lemon like this before," Jack said, more to himself than the squirrel. "I wonder what could be causing it." The squirrel scampered closer, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Jack watched it curiously, wondering if the little creature might have some insight to offer. "Well, I suppose there's only one way to find out," Jack said, determination in his voice. He turned the lemon over in his hand once more, then nodded decisively. "Time to investigate." With that, he headed back towards the house, the squirrel trailing behind him, its eyes filled with a curious interest. Jack hurried through the front door, the lemon still clutched in his hand. "Emily?" he called out, his voice tinged with urgency. His wife emerged from the kitchen, a concerned look on her face. "What is it, dear? What's wrong?" "Look at this," Jack said, holding up the mottled fruit. "I've never seen a lemon like this before. Something's not right." Emily took the lemon from him, her brow furrowed as she examined it. That is strange. Where did you find this?" "In the garden," Jack replied, running a hand through his hair. "The tree is in bad shape, and the other lemons look just as odd." "Well, we can't have that," Emily said, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We'll have to get to the bottom of this." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Jack said, a spark of excitement in his voice. "I was hoping you'd be willing to help me investigate." Emily smiled and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Of course, my love. I'm always here to support you, no matter how peculiar the problem may be." "Wonderful!" Jack exclaimed, his face lighting up. "I have a feeling this is going to be quite an adventure." The squirrel, who had followed Jack into the house, chittered in agreement from its perch on the windowsill. "And it looks like we have a furry little assistant to help us along the way," Emily said with a chuckle, reaching out to stroke the squirrel's soft fur. Jack grinned, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Then let's get started, shall we?" With a nod, Emily placed the lemon on the kitchen counter, ready to embark on this unexpected quest. Oi, oi, oh. Jack and Emily gathered around the kitchen counter, the mottled lemon sitting between them. "So, what do you think is going on with this thing?" Jack asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. Emily hummed thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the discolored skin of the fruit. "It's certainly not a normal lemon, that's for sure. The texture and color are wrong." The squirrel, who had perched itself on the edge of the counter, let out a curious chitter, its beady eyes fixed on the lemon. You know, I've been tending to that tree for years, and I've never seen anything like this, Jack said, shaking his head. It's got me stumped. Well, we'll just have to get to the bottom of it, won't we? Emily said, a determined glint in her eye. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation. I hope so, Jack replied, running a hand through his hair. I hate to think something's wrong with the tree. The squirrel let out another chitter, as if to offer its own input on the matter. You know, I think our little friend here might have some ideas, Emily said with a chuckle, reaching out to give the squirrel a gentle pat on the head. Maybe we should start by taking a closer look at the tree itself, Jack mused, his gaze shifting to the window that overlooked the garden. See if we can spot any other signs of trouble. Excellent idea, Emily said, nodding in agreement. And perhaps we can do a bit of research, see if we can find any information on what might be causing this. Sounds like a plan, Jack said, a determined smile spreading across his face. Let's get started, shall we? The squirrel chittered in approval, its tail twitching with excitement as it watched the two humans prepare to embark on their investigation. Jack and Emily huddled around the kitchen table, the strange lemon sitting between them. Okay, so where do we even start? Jack asked, drumming his fingers on the tabletop. Well, I think the first step is to see if we can find any information on what might be causing this, Emily replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. The squirrel, who had perched itself on the back of a chair, let out a soft chitter, as if offering its own suggestion. You know, that's not a bad idea, Jack said, turning to the furry creature. Maybe we should reach out to someone who knows a thing or two about plants and gardening. Exactly what I was thinking, Emily said, a smile spreading across her face. She reached for the phone and began dialing a number. Who are you calling? Jack asked, leaning in curiously. Professor Wilkins, Emily replied, her fingers drumming against the tabletop. He's a renowned botanist, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to take a look at this lemon and offer some insight. The phone rang a few times before a gruff voice answered. Hello? Oh, Professor Wilkins? This is Emily from down the street, Emily said, her voice warm and friendly. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to help us with a bit of a gardening mystery. There was a brief pause, and then the professor's voice came through the line, tinged with curiosity. A gardening mystery, you say? Well, you've certainly piqued my interest. What seems to be the problem? Jack and Emily exchanged a glance, and then Jack leaned in, his voice eager. Well, you see, Professor, we've got this lemon tree in our garden, and the fruit it's producing is, well, it's not quite right. Not quite right, you say? The professor replied, his tone intrigued. Well, I'd be more than happy to take a look. When can I come by? Emily's face lit up with a smile. How about this afternoon? We'd really appreciate your expertise. Excellent, excellent, the professor said, the sound of shuffling papers echoing through the line. I'll be there as soon as I can. This should be quite an interesting investigation. Thank you, Professor, Jack said, his voice filled with relief. We'll see you soon. As Emily hung up the phone, the squirrel let out an excited chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. The door to Professor Wilkins' laboratory swung open, and Jack and Emily stepped inside, the mottled lemon carefully cradled in Emily's hands. Welcome, welcome, the professor exclaimed, his eyes twinkling with excitement behind his thick-rimmed glasses. I have been eagerly awaiting your arrival. Thank you so much for taking the time to look at this, Professor, Emily said, gently placing the lemon on the cluttered workbench. Not at all, my dear, not at all, the professor replied, his gaze fixed on the peculiar fruit. This is precisely the kind of mystery I live for. Jack chuckled, his hand resting on the small of Emily's back. Ah, ah. Well, we're certainly glad to have your expertise on our side. The squirrel, who had accompanied the couple, scampered up onto the workbench, its nose twitching as it sniffed the lemon. Ah, Yes, very interesting, the professor murmured, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in for a closer look. The discoloration, the unusual texture. This is certainly no ordinary lemon. He gently picked up the fruit, turning it over in his hand. Tell me, where did you find this remarkable specimen? In our garden, Emily replied, her brow furrowed with concern. The tree it came from seems to be in distress. Fascinating, the professor said, his eyes gleaming with scientific curiosity. Well, let's see what we can uncover, shall we? With that, he set the lemon down and began rummaging through the various tools and instruments that cluttered his workbench. Jack and Emily exchanged a hopeful glance, their fingers intertwined as they watched the professor work. Ah! Moments later, the professor let out a triumphant exclamation. Aha! I think I've found the culprit. He gestured for the couple to come closer, his eyes alight with excitement. Ah, you see, this lemon has been exposed to a highly unusual form of radiation, one that I've only ever encountered in my most recent research. Jack and Emily leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Radiation? Jack asked, his brow furrowing. What does that mean? It means, the professor said, a grin spreading across his face, that this lemon possesses extraordinary abilities that could change the world as we know it. The squirrel let out an excited chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. The professor's laboratory was a flurry of activity as he conducted a series of experiments on the mysterious lemon. Fascinating, he murmured, his eyes fixed on the readouts from his various instruments. Simply fascinating. Jack and Emily watched with bated breath, their fingers intertwined as they waited for the professor to share his findings. You see, the professor began, adjusting his glasses, this lemon has been exposed to a highly concentrated form of radiation, one that I've only ever encountered in my most recent research. Radiation? Emily echoed, her brow furrowed with concern. Is it dangerous? The professor chuckled, a mischievous glint in his eye. Dangerous? Oh, my dear, not at all. In fact, this lemon possesses extraordinary abilities that could change the world as we know it. Jack and Emily exchanged a puzzled glance, their curiosity piqued. What kind of abilities? Jack asked, leaning forward in his chair. Well, for starters, the professor said, a grin spreading across his face. This lemon has the ability to manipulate the very fabric of reality. The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out an excited chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. Manipulate reality? Emily breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. How is that possible? Ah, my dear, that's the beauty of it, the professor exclaimed, his hands gesturing wildly. You see, the radiation has imbued this lemon with the power to alter the molecular structure of any object it comes into contact with. He plucked the lemon from the workbench and held it up, his eyes shining with excitement. Watch this. With a flick of his wrist, the professor tossed the lemon into the air. As it fell back down, it transformed into a bright yellow canary, which fluttered around the room, its wings beating furiously. Jack and Emily stared in stunned silence, their mouths agape. The squirrel let out a series of delighted chatters, its eyes fixed on the transformed lemon-turned bird. Incredible, Jack breathed, his gaze following the canary as it darted around the laboratory. "Isn't it just?" the professor said, a proud smile on his face. "And this is only the beginning. I can't wait to see what other wonders this lemon has in store." Emily reached out, her fingers gently brushing against the lemon's transformed shell. "Professor, I don't even know what to say." The professor chuckled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Then don't say anything, my dear. Let's simply enjoy the mystery and see where it takes us." The canary let out a melodious trill, as if in agreement, and the squirrel scampered after it, its tail held high with excitement. The laboratory was alive with a sense of wonder and excitement as Jack, Emily, and Professor Wilkins continued their investigation into the extraordinary lemon. "This is truly remarkable," the professor murmured, his eyes fixed on the various readouts and data displays that surrounded them. Jack and Emily stood by his side, their fingers intertwined as they watched the professor work. "So, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Jack asked, his brow furrowed with curiosity. "Well, my dear boy," the professor replied. A gleam in his eye, it would appear that this lemon has been imbued with the ability to manipulate the very fabric of reality. Emily's eyes widened, her grip on Jack's hand tightening. Manipulate reality? How is that even possible? The professor chuckled, his fingers dancing across the various instruments on his workbench. "Ah, my dear, that's the beauty of it. The radiation that has affected this lemon has given it the power to alter the molecular structure of any object it comes into contact with." The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out an excited chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. "And you say this radiation is something you've only encountered in your recent research?" Jack asked, his gaze shifting between the professor and the lemon. "Precisely," the professor replied, his voice tinged with a sense of wonder. "It's a highly specialized form of radiation that I've been studying for some time now, but I've never seen its effects manifested quite like this." Emily's brow furrowed, a concerned expression crossing her face. "Does that mean this lemon is dangerous?" The professor paused, his fingers stilling on the instruments. "Dangerous? Oh, my dear, not at all. In fact, this lemon could be the key to unlocking a whole new realm of scientific possibilities." Jack and Emily exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of awe and trepidation. "But," the professor continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper, "I fear that this lemon may also be a highly sought-after target for those who would seek to exploit its power for their own nefarious purposes." The squirrel let out a series of alarmed chatters, its eyes darting around the room, as if sensing a threat. "Then we must protect it," Jack said, his voice firm. "We can't let this fall into the wrong hand." Emily nodded in agreement, her grip on Jack's hand tightening. "Absolutely. We'll do whatever it takes to keep this lemon safe." The professor smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Excellent. Then let's get to work, shall we?" The laboratory was filled with a sense of unease as the trio pored over the data and readouts. "This lemon is truly remarkable," the professor murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But I fear it may also be a target for those who would seek to exploit its power." Jack and Emily exchanged a worried glance, the squirrel's nervous chittering adding to the tension in the room. "Who would want to do that?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. The professor's expression darkened. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Blackwood?" Jack echoed, his widening. "The reclusive scientist who's been conducting all those controversial experiments?" The professor nodded grimly. "The very same. He's been obsessed with this particular form of radiation for years, and I fear he'll stop at nothing to get his hands on it." Emily's fingers tightened around Jack's hand. Then we have to protect the lemon, she said, her voice resolute. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands. Precisely, the professor replied, his eyes gleaming with determination, which is why we must act quickly and decisively. The squirrel let out a series of agitated chatters, its tail twitching nervously. But how? Jack asked, his brow furrowed with concern. What can we do against someone as powerful and influential as Dr. Blackwood? The professor's lips curled into a wry smile. Ah, my dear boy, that's where the true challenge lies. But I assure you, we are more than a match for that scoundrel. He turned to the workbench, his fingers dancing across the various instruments and devices. We'll need to fortify this laboratory, set up a series of security measures to keep him at bay. Jack and Emily watched, their expressions a mix of determination and trepidation, as the professor set to work. The squirrel, sensing the gravity of the situation, scampered to the edge of the workbench, its eyes fixed on the lemon that had sparked this entire adventure. Don't worry, my furry friend, the professor said, his voice low and reassuring. We won't let that scoundrel Blackwood get his hands on this remarkable fruit. Jack and Emily nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening as they prepared to defend the lemon against the looming threat. The laboratory was a flurry of activity, as Jack, Emily, and Professor Wilkins worked tirelessly to fortify their defenses. We need to make sure this place is impenetrable, the professor said, his brow furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the settings on a series of high-tech security devices. But Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the mottled lemon that sat at the center of the workbench. Absolutely. We can't let Dr. Blackwood get his hands on this. Emily stood beside him, her fingers drumming nervously on the edge of the table. But what if he finds a way in? What if he's too powerful for us to stop? The professor paused, his eyes meeting Emily's with a reassuring gaze. My dear, we won't let that happen. I've spent years studying this radiation, and I know its secrets better than anyone. We'll be ready for him. We'll be ready for him. The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out a series of anxious chatters, its tail twitching with nervous energy. Don't worry, little friend, Jack said, reaching out to gently stroke the squirrel's soft fur. We're going to protect this lemon no matter what. Emily placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, her expression resolute. He's right. We're in this together, and we won't let Dr. Blackwood win. The professor chuckled, a gleam of determination in his eyes. That's the spirit. Now, let's get to work. There's no time to waste. The trio set to work, their movements quick and efficient as they activated a series of high-tech security measures. With lasers, motion sensors, and electromagnetic fields were all deployed, creating a formidable barrier around the precious lemon. The squirrel watched with rapt attention, its beady eyes darting from one device to the next, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. There, the professor said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. I dare say even Dr. Blackwood himself would have a hard time getting through that. Jack and Emily exchanged a relieved glance, their fingers intertwined as they gazed at the lemon, now safely ensconced within the laboratory's defenses. We're ready, Jack said, his voice filled with determination. Bring it on, Dr. Blackwood. The squirrel let out a triumphant chitter. Its tail, held high as it too, seemed to share in the group's newfound confidence. The trio huddled around the workbench, their expressions serious as they discussed their next move. We can't keep the lemon here, Jack said, his brow furrowed with concern. It's too risky. If Dr. Blackwood finds out about it, he'll stop at nothing to get his hands on it. Emily nodded in agreement, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. Jack's right. We need to find a safer place to hide it. Sorry. The professor stroked his chin, his eyes narrowed in thought. Yes. Yes, I see your point. But where could we possibly keep it secure enough to evade someone like Blackwood? The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out a series of curious chatters, as if offering its own suggestion. Wait! That's it! The professor exclaimed, his face lighting up with a grin. I have the perfect place in mind. What? Really? Jack and Emily leaned in, their expressions hopeful. Where? Jack asked, his voice low and urgent. My family's old cabin, deep in the heart of the forest. The professor replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. It's completely off the grid, with no electricity or modern amenities. Blackwood would never think to look for it there. Emily's eyes widened, a relieved smile spreading across her face. That sounds perfect. When can we leave? The professor chuckled, already moving to gather a few essential supplies. Right away, my dear. Time is of the essence. Jack reached out and gently picked up the lemon, cradling it in his hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Don't worry, he murmured, his gaze fixed on the mottled fruit. We'll keep you safe. The squirrel scampered closer, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air, seemingly sensing the importance of their mission. With a nod of determination, the group set out. The lemon carefully tucked away in a reinforced container, ready to be whisked to its new, secure hiding place. The laboratory was quiet, save for the hum of the various security devices that had been installed to protect the precious lemon. Jack, Emily, and Professor Wilkins stood around the workbench, their expressions a mix of relief and anticipation. Well, I must say, I'm quite impressed with our handiwork, the professor said, his eyes twinkling with pride. That lemon is as safe as can be. Emily let out a sigh of relief, her fingers intertwined with Jack's. I'm so glad we were able to get it to the cabin in time. I don't even want to think about what would happen if Blackwood got his hands on it. Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the reinforced container that now housed the lemon. Me neither. But now that it's secure, maybe we can take a closer look at its abilities. The professor's eyes lit up with excitement. Ah, yes. An excellent idea. There's still so much we have yet to discover about this remarkable fruit. The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out a curious chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. Well, then let's not waste any time, the professor said, already reaching for his instruments. I am eager to see what other wonders this lemon has in store. Jack and Emily watched as the professor began a series of tests and experiments, his fingers deftly manipulating the various devices and readouts. Moments later, the professor let out a triumphant exclamation. Aha! Just as I suspected. Jack and Emily leaned in, their expressions filled with curiosity. What is it? Emily asked, her voice hushed. It would appear that this lemon has the ability to not only transform other objects, but to also manipulate the very fabric of time and space. The professor replied, his eyes shining with wonder. Time and space. Jack echoed, his brow furrowing in disbelief. How is that possible? The professor chuckled, his fingers dancing across the various instruments. My dear boy, the power of this lemon is truly extraordinary. It seems to be able to bend the laws of reality itself. The squirrel let out a series of excited chatters, its tail twitching with unbridled enthusiasm. This is incredible, Emily breathed, her eyes wide with awe. Just imagine what we could do with this kind of power. The professor's expression sobered, his gaze meeting Emily's with a serious intensity. Precisely, my dear. And that is why we must protect it at all costs. Jack and Emily exchanged a determined glance, their resolve hardening as they realized the true magnitude of the task before them. The laboratory was alive with a sense of wonder and excitement as the trio continued to uncover the lemon's extraordinary abilities. Incredible, the professor murmured, his eyes fixed on the various readouts and data displays. This lemon is capable of manipulating the very fabric of reality itself. Jack and Emily leaned in, their expressions a mix of awe and trepidation. What do you mean? Jack asked, his brow furrowed with curiosity. Well, my dear boy, the professor replied. A gleam in his eye, it would appear that this lemon can not only transform other objects, but it can also bend the laws of time and space. Emily's eyes widened, her fingers tightening around Jack's hand. Time and space? How is that even possible? The professor chuckled, his fingers dancing across the various instruments. My dear, that's the beauty of it. The radiation that has affected this lemon has given it the power to manipulate the very fabric of reality itself. The squirrel, who had been perched on the edge of the workbench, let out an excited chitter, its tail twitching with anticipation. So, what does this mean? Jack asked, his gaze shifting between the professor and the lemon. How can we use this power? Use it? The professor echoed, a wry smile spreading across his face. My dear boy, the possibilities are endless. With this lemon we could do anything. Travel through time, bend the laws of physics, even reshape the very world around us. Emily's brow furrowed, a concerned expression crossing her face. But surely, such power must come with great responsibility. We can't just use it however we please. The professor nodded, his expression sobering. Precisely, my dear. Which is why we must be extremely careful in how we wield this lemon's abilities. Jack's gaze hardened, his jaw set with determination. Then we'll use it to stop Blackwood, he said, his voice firm. We'll use the lemon's power against him and make sure he never gets his hands on it. Emily and the professor exchanged a glance, their expressions mirroring Jack's resolve. Yes, the professor said, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's exactly what we'll do. Blackwood will never know what hit him. The squirrel let out a series of excited chatters, its tail twitching with anticipation as it sensed the team's newfound determination. With a renewed sense of purpose, the trio set to work, their minds racing with the endless possibilities that the lemon's power presented. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the gentle breeze. Jack, Emily, and Professor Wilkins stood in the shadows, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Aurora, he's coming, the professor whispered, his voice tense. I can feel it. Emily's fingers tightened around Jack's hand, her expression a mix of fear and determination. We have to protect the lemon at all costs. Jack nodded, his jaw set with resolve. We will. No matter what. The squirrel, who had been perched on a nearby branch, let out a series of anxious chatters, its tail twitching nervously. Suddenly the sound of a twig snapping echoed through the trees, and the trio tensed, their eyes narrowing as they searched for the source. Well, 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 a deep, sinister voice drawled, sending a chill down their spines. If it isn't my old friend, Professor Wilkins. Dr. Blackwood emerged from the shadows, a malicious grin on his face. Behind him, a group of burly henchmen followed, their eyes scanning the area with ruthless efficiency. Blackwood! The professor spat, his voice dripping with contempt. I should have known you'd find us. Of course, Blackwood replied, his gaze shifting to the reinforced container that Jack was clutching protectively. And I see you've been keeping something rather special for me. Jack stepped forward, his body shielding the container. You're not getting your hands on that lemon, Blackwood. Not if we have anything to say about it. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. Oh, I think you'll find that you have very little say in the matter. With a nod, he gestured to his henchmen, who immediately sprang into action, their weapons drawn and their movements swift and precise. Jack, Emily, and the professor braced themselves, their own defenses ready as they prepared to defend the precious lemon at all costs. The air was thick with tension as Jack, Emily, and Professor Wilkins stood their ground, the reinforced container holding the precious lemon clutched tightly in Jack's arms. You'll never get your hands on this lemon, Blackwood, the professor growled, his eyes narrowed with determination. Blackwood let out a sinister chuckle, his gaze fixed on the container. Oh, I think you'll find that I have no intention of leaving here without it. The henchmen moved in, their weapons raised, and their expressions menacing. Stay back, Emily shouted, her voice trembling with fear and resolve. The squirrel, who had been perched on a nearby branch, let out a series of frantic chatters, its tail twitching with agitation. Pathetic, Blackwood sneered, his hand raised in a dismissive gesture. Attack! The henchmen surged forward, their movements swift and coordinated. Jack, Emily, and the professor braced themselves, their bodies poised to defend the lemon at all costs. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the container, causing everyone to shield their eyes. What the? Ew! Blackwood exclaimed, his voice laced with confusion and alarm. When the light faded, the henchmen were nowhere to be seen, and in their place stood a group of harmless, brightly colored parrots, their feathers ruffled, and their eyes wide with bewilderment. Blackwood stared at the transformed henchman, his mouth agape. Impossible, he cried, his voice tinged with disbelief. The professor let out a triumphant laugh, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Ah, but you see, Blackwood, the power of this lemon is far beyond your comprehension. Jack and Emily exchanged a relieved glance, their fingers intertwined as they watched the parrots flutter about, their once menacing henchmen now reduced to harmless, feathered creatures. To harmless, feathered creatures. Blackwood's face contorted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. This isn't over, he growled, his voice dripping with venom. I'll be back, and next time I won't be so easily defeated. With that, he turned and fled, his footsteps echoing through the trees as he disappeared into the distance. The squirrel let out a series of victorious chatters, its tail held high with pride. The parrots fluttered about, their once menacing henchmen now reduced to harmless, feathered creatures. Well, that was certainly an unexpected turn of events, the professor said, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jack and Emily exchanged a relieved glance, their fingers intertwined as they watched the transformed henchman. I can't believe it worked. Emily breathed, her voice tinged with wonder. The lemon's power is truly incredible. The squirrel let out a series of triumphant chatters, its tail held high with pride. Indeed, the professor replied, his gaze fixed on the reinforced container that Jack was still clutching. But we can't afford to let our guard down. Blackwood will be back, and he'll be even more determined to get his hands on that lemon. Jack nodded, his expression hardening. Then we need to get out of here fast. We can't risk him catching up to us. Agreed, the professor said, already moving towards the path that led deeper into the forest. Follow me, quickly now. The group hurried through the trees, the parrots fluttering behind them, their cries echoing through the air. Do you think Blackwood will be able to find us? Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. I'm afraid that's a distinct possibility, the professor replied, his brow furrowed with worry. We'll need to find a new hiding place, one that's even more secure than the cabin. Jack tightened his grip on the container, his jaw set with determination. We'll do whatever it takes to keep this lemon safe. I won't let Blackwood get his hands on it. The squirrel scampered alongside them, its eyes darting from one tree to the next, as if keeping a vigilant watch for any sign of danger. As they pressed on, the sound of the parrot's cries faded into the distance, leaving the group to navigate the winding forest path in tense silence.